Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. My name is Pascal Lota. I'm an associate professor at Kyoto University, and today I am joined by my friend and colleague, IR analyst Lasha Kasradze. Lasha, welcome back to the channel.
Thank you. It's good to be back, Pascal.
Great having you again. Lasha, a lot of things are happening right now in and around Georgia, and you're the man to talk to about this one. Let's maybe start with something that surprised me the most. Just yesterday, you actually are the one who informed me. One of Georgia's largest private TV stations, Imedi TV, just got sanctioned by the UK. Can you give me the updates there and also let our viewers know from outside Georgia what Imedi TV is and how big it is in Georgia?
Absolutely. This is another bizarre event in the chain of many bizarre events that have befallen upon Georgia in the last few years and months. So, Imedi TV is the largest broadcasting network. For our Western audiences, I guess CNN or Fox News come to mind for compare. Just to compare. But for a small country like Georgia, it's the most popular and sort of all-encompassing, if you will, a broadcasting media network. And just this morning, I heard this. Everyone did, of my colleagues, I'm sure, that Imedi TV was sanctioned by the United Kingdom. Um, and the allegation is sort of par for the course, which is that Imedi TV was provoking. Just think about what they said. They were, paraphrasing, of course, but they were provoking or stoking more uh, conflict or, in Ukraine, as if Imedi TV has anything to do with the conflict in Ukraine, or that it has caused the conflict or Ukraine, or somehow it's augmenting the conflict in Ukraine by saying that basically, overall speaking, Georgia made the right choice not to get entangled in opening up the second front or one way or the other, helping in terms of military support Ukraine, because it understood that it was going to be existential it would present an existential threat for Georgia. That's basically the narrative that Imedi TV and its editorial team have maintained all throughout since the beginning of the war, which under normal circumstances, within normal sort of collective psychological condition of a state, shouldn't be a shock or something that is so unacceptable that you can sanction a major TV station in a sovereign state. So you can see sort of this. We all know the phrase liberal fascism. I don't know what else to call it. Um, in other words, if you don't paddle their propaganda, then you have no right to speak. And they call it liberalism. They call that democracy. They call that promotion of rights. Um, but if you reverse this, if you reverse the situation, if you listen to, say, the opposition television stations that are continuing to glorify some of the neocon former stars or famous or infamous stars, like Tori Newland, for example, being hero or being a democracy exporter and being this brave woman who was giving away sandwiches in the middle of Maidan in 2014. That is allowed. Propagating the very exact individuals and propping up the reputations of the individuals that are known to be neocons and known to have had visceral hatred of Russia and are basically known to be causes of provocation basically promoting this war. Glorifying them and defending them publicly and in the media sphere, that's fine. But anyone who says otherwise and says, wait a minute, look, we appreciate what, say, the neocon establishment, say, under Bush was trying to do, but that did not work out. So let us just step back from that and, you know, uh, think twice about before we get on that bandwagon of cursing Russia or of continuing to allow Georgia to become this battering ram against Russia. No, that's unacceptable. That's propaganda. That is considered to be pro-Russian. Um, so, in other words, long story short, you basically have to. The only time these people will be satisfied is if you sacrifice yourself for their ideology and for their visceral hatred of Russia.
Yeah, and again, like this is it's Imedi TV has a clear positioning when it comes, in my view, or what I've heard from you, because I don't speak Georgian, but it has a clear positioning in regards to the war in Ukraine on and the local politics and so on. But most TV stations do, and most newspapers do. I mean, we know what to expect from articles in the New York Times, and we know what to expect from articles in other outlets, right? I mean, having a political tint, right, is normal. So the allegation that something is propaganda is really more the admission that one form of looking at international relations, or one form of looking at politics, is something that you approve of, and the other form is something that you don't. But the fact that we are now in a world where the West, the free liberal West, is starting to just sanction news outlets left and right, is really an admission of something going terribly wrong. Jacques Beau, my countryman who's now sanctioned in the EU, keeps pointing out, in the Cold War, in the West, in Europe, you could buy the Pravda. My mother, who used to work at a station kiosk in several cities in Switzerland, she said, "Oh yeah, we sold the Pravda back in the 70s and 80s. We did. It was a popular one." And nobody had the idea of sanctioning the Pravda because it was spreading Soviet propaganda, which it was, but it didn't matter. Now it suddenly does. Do you have any thoughts about this, and can you maybe tell us a little bit of where to think of, where to position Imedi TV in terms of their political positioning?
Absolutely, sure. So I'm going to build off on what you just said. So basically, Imedi TV is no more propagandistic than what we see here in, say, Fox News or CNN, for example, or MSNBC. Um, so it's one thing to lie blatantly, manufacture truths, and I don't think any sort of a freshman student of journalism will approve of that, right? But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about having a certain direction, certain narrative within the sort of within the editorial and broadcasting philosophy of Imedi TV that supports a certain position. If you have another television station that opposes that position, by all means, present your case, right? And so let's have that media, sort of a free space exchange of ideas, if you will, right? Remember, this is what they encourage, right, from the European Union and from Washington, and fostering the difference of opinions and a critical thinking. Well, what Imedi TV has been doing is that Imedi TV has basically argued that uh, blind adherence to Western propaganda, and first of all, it defined it as propaganda. It turned out to be as propaganda, as we all know in the collective West, will cause Georgia more harm than good. And Imedi TV, whether there have been some rotten, journalists, some bad apples, just like in any organization, you might have no idea who these people are, but overall, Imedi TV has done a pretty good job in terms of portraying the specter and the dangers facing both Georgian politics internally and externally. And it informed people as such. It's, those who listen, I don't know what the statistics are exactly, but half the country listens to Imedi TV. And now you are telling them, no, you can't broadcast your views and the information based on your research. And the simple question that becomes, so what do we tell the Georgian society, the segment of the society that listens to us? Well, we don't care. And so just imagine that it's not just about the Imedi TV as a corporation or an entity, business entity, or as even a propaganda, a quote unquote organization. But most importantly, what do you tell the people? So you basically, a foreign power forbids one of the biggest television stations from informing its own population. That's what it comes down to. Um, and I, as someone who observes this, as analyzes what Imedi TV has done and how it broadcasts its news and analysis, I fundamentally, I really don't see anything that is worth of a panic or some sort of a catastrophic, practice in the media sphere that it has engaged in. It basically has a certain direction. It disagrees with liberal internationalist and liberal hegemonic approach. It disagrees with support of murdering regimes like Saakashvili's regime, because it was Saakashvili's regime under the banner of democracy promotion under George W. Bush that actually physically raided Imedi TV. We're talking about paradox and contradiction of the century. I mean, these people are telling you about democracy and freedom of speech and freedom of the media, and their goons, supported in Tbilisi, are using special forces to raid your offices. So that's what basically Imedi TV has stood against.
Yeah. Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. It's really, to me, it's just another example of blatant hypocrisy. And I just need to make this point, Lasha, to show you this one here. I hope I can make it a little bit bigger. Let's see. Anyhow, what the UK enacted in 2023, the Online Safety Act. Just for a little bit of context, in what world we are moving now, where the UK is the one with this provision that I'll show you now in its legal codes that is accusing Georgia of blatant misinformation. In the Online Safety Act, on paragraph 179, the Online Safety Act defines fails communication offenses. A person commits an offense if the person sends a message, the message conveys information that the person knows to be fails. At the time of sending it, the person intends the message or the information on it to cause non-trivial psychological or physical or likely audience harm to a likely audience, and the person has no reasonable excuse for sending the message. This is a communication offense in the UK. But what I want to point out is that the very next paragraph, 180, so you're not allowed to lie. The UK punishes you if you lie on social media or on media in general. You're not allowed to commit a fails communication offense. But Article 180, exemptions from the offense. A recognized news publisher cannot commit an offense under paragraph 179. just for everybody to see. It's like the UK officially allows their broadcasters, the BBC is officially allowed to lie. They are allowed, they have the okay from His Majesty's government that they're allowed to commit communication offenses that everybody else is not allowed to do. And if you're an official broadcaster, then no, go ahead, you can do this. That's the country with that kind of regulation in its legal codes that is sanctioning a foreign TV station for saying for committing offenses. It's mind-boggling. It's just hypocritical beyond belief. But Lasha,
but it's also very much Orwellian. Have you noticed how the language is so Orwellian? The way they write, the way they say, who can speak, who cannot speak. I'm glad you dug this document out. This is good.
Yeah, and it's an important document. This is the Online Safety Act. This is how the UK can legally approach and indict people
Yeah.
under its legal codes, right? So you can be punished for all of this. Good thing to know that the BBC cannot be punished. Any holder of a license, of a broadcasting license, cannot be punished for saying something knowingly untrue. Yeah, so but we see how there's definitely two sets of standards, right? One set applies to us, and the official ones, and everybody who has a license from us, and another set applies to everybody else, and we will, from a high horse, then tell everybody what kind of bad people they are. um
Yes. Yes.
Anyhow, is there anything more to add about Imedi TV, or shall we move to another saga, which is Mr. Vance visiting the region in the
Yeah.
Caucasus, but not but skipping Georgia?
Correct. Well, on Imedi TV, I think we pretty much covered it. It's a great tragedy, really, mostly of the Western world. As we have mentioned many, many times before, they're becoming sort of victims of their own fanaticism and ideology. And this is sad to see that this is happening in the West. Like you mentioned about Pravda and the Soviet era media, where people only had one or two channels. It was understood what was happening. But when the West comes in the post-Cold War era and declares sort of freedom and prosperity and rights for everyone, and now we sort of degenerate into such pathologies, this is really sad to watch. But in terms of Imedi TV, there is nothing exclusively horrible about what Imedi TV has done, and it's basically. I've done business there. First of all, I have to say this, right, as a warning, so that others won't accuse me of hypocrisy. But we would talk about every single sort of a problem in the foreign policy and in the changing world affairs that you and I and our colleagues have constantly continued to talk about, and then we would broadcast that for the Georgian audience. And there was nothing, and we brought some really high quality people and high quality guests, including you, of course. And when we first started out, and I think collectively speaking, those wonderful guests and people that would graciously agree to come on Imedi, and they've provided very objective, you know, well-researched, scholarly opinions, and their reputation is unshakable. So that's what Imedi has been doing, as far as I know.
Our colleague Ian Proud, a former UK diplomat, actually does have I don't know whether it's a weekly show or not, but he also broadcasts over there. So I mean, good people, a lot
Yeah,
of good people were using Imedi, and you don't have to agree with them. You can
yeah,
disagree, you can think that they're wrong, and you can argue against them, and you can go on broadcast that on any kind of station or channel that you want. But we're now at the sad point where the West is not trying to compete anymore in for like opinions and so on, but just resorts to, well,
yeah.
um blatant sanctioning and censorship. It's basically a censorship approach, although this one, since it cannot censor directly in Georgia, it can do the next best thing, which is try to hurt these institutions economically as much as possible.
Just one last point on the Imedi TV. So they're basically equating criticism, questioning, and sort of the validity of this war, and especially Georgia's position, which Georgia has been helping Ukraine on the international scene in terms of support of its national, of its sovereignty. It has been a unrelenting proponent of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but Georgia has declared that militarily we won't be able to help because it will be suicidal. The moment you start to get into that territory, they equate that as you being anti-Ukraine. This is
Yeah.
how propagandistic this entire thing has become. So they really leave you no benefit of the
Space.
doubt. Yeah. So, and then you automatically pro-Russian.
Right.
So it's sad, but
It is sad, but it's what it is. Let's move to Vance. So what why did he skip Georgia? Why did he visit everybody except Georgia? And were you guys, I mean, were you pissed?
well, when the news first spread, it caused sort of a shockwaves, political shockwaves, if you will, of sorts. I didn't think it was going to be eventually some sort of catastrophic sort of rejection of Georgia after 30 years of U.S.-Georgian partnership, right? Nothing nowhere near that. But, politics is very sensitive. And when the vice president of the United States skips the South, Georgia, one of the central countries in the South Caucasus, and goes to, say, Azerbaijan, not that Azerbaijan is any less, or Armenia, but I'm just saying, traditionally speaking, we remember the days when George W. Bush came to Tbilisi in 2005 was a historic trip, which eventually upset the natural order of things to the point where in 2008 followed, right, 3 years later. So, right. So, but nevertheless, Georgia was this sort of this beacon of liberty, right? To repeat George W. Bush's words in the region. So, since, of course, the opposition figures, radicals, pro-Westerners, so to speak, they have accused Georgia of sort of, turning its back against the collective West. Um, so, but clearly that's got nothing to do with it. Georgia has realized that this is basically the era of myth shattering and myth collapsing, and that whole sort of neoliberal neocon propaganda was collapsing, and they just had to really save their skin and act more pragmatically towards Russia. Okay, so that's the long story short. But in terms of Vance's visit and then in the South Caucasus. Here is the irony. Georgia is very well positioned strategically. Georgia has shown behind the scenes strategic patience, and to a large extent, I would even say confidence that even though politically this sort of skipping of Georgia didn't look good. Certainly, you cannot hide that fact. I think in the long term, Georgia sort of is recouping this now, in a sense, because given its geopolitical, first of all, geopolitically speaking, Georgia is indispensable. You cannot dispense with Georgia. It's an indispensable state in the middle of the South Caucasus. It borders the Black Sea. That's the exit towards the off the Black Sea coast onto Europe. And now, if you recall, my good colleagues, Georgian paradigm of peace, that whole concept, that's the sort of irony of this. Vance's trip, in my view, has brought back sort of the theories and concepts of what has been talked about in Tbilisi with my colleagues and the rector of the Sukhumi State University, for example, when the United States is finally starting to look at the South Caucasus as a geoeconomic project, relegating to the margins, if you will. Perhaps this is, not relegating to the margin. Geopolitics will always be there, but looking at the region more transactionally, certainly devoid of liberal internationalist hubris, right? That whole ideology is gone. And now the entire sort of strategic focus is on geoeconomic projects. Now, you can say that this is sort of a Trojan horse. This is yet another way of balancing against Russia, if not worse. This is about isolating Iran because of that Zangezur corridor. This is about enhancing and deepening that whole Turkic the Turkic world, and enhancing sort of Israeli-backed Azerbaijan sort of powerhouse vis-a-vis Turkey. But I think that's a stretch. Yes, there is a danger of that. But I have always countered that argument by saying that Russia sits in the middle of all this, and in its traditional understanding of the region, Russia will never give up its vital national security interests. I've always also said that Georgia and the region, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been known for geoeconomic projects to which Russia has acquiesced in the past. So, I think I'm just going to leave it within those contours, because, and so go back to Georgia. I think Georgia will not lose its position, even though the trip, right? Trump's new project that he sent Vance for to Baku and Yerevan. So we have the Caspian Sea. The mosaic hasn't really changed much. The middle corridor, multi-modal middle corridor, is one of the key transit routes that Georgia plays a key role in. This is yet another additional. So Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, they're all coming down through the Caspian Sea and then vis-a-vis Georgia into the Black Sea and Turkey, right? So Georgia is not losing its geopolitical stance and geoeconomic importance. The only thing that Georgia, in my view, has to worry about is economics itself. So domestically speaking, trade balance, manufacturing sector, they have to improve on, right? So in other words, its own economic manufacturing base. But in terms of the idea that Georgia will be sort of extracted out, or plucked out of its historic region because of TRIP or because of this Angazura corridor. Quite the contrary, it's a complementary project, in my view. And Aliyev, actually, the president of Azerbaijan, just recently, about a week or so ago, at the security conference, declared outright that Georgia not only complements this project, but he thanked officials Tbilisi, for working with Baku when Baku transferred its first load of commodities and energy infrastructure, products through Armenia. And so they were basically, he was outright, blatantly supportive of Georgia's role in the region. So, so you see the basic infrastructure, geoeconomic infrastructure, Georgia occupies a central role in it as a transit state. And there is plenty of room to build off of that as well. Mainly, of course, that middle corridor, Trans-Caspian corridor, also it's called. So I think Georgia is fine in terms of strategy and in terms of sort of long-term positioning in the region. One thing that could be concerning is how Georgia handles the changing environment with the United States and with Europe. And it just has to, in my view, it just has to sort of deepen sort of diplomatic relations with Washington. In my opinion, I might be wrong on this, but it just has to be more active and more present. That's the area where Georgia could use, I would argue, some help. But other than that, I think Tbilisi has shown some serious patience, strategic patience. And I'm pretty sure that at the end of the day, they will improve the relations with Washington, and things will get back to normal, because there is no fundamental reason why this sort of Washington's ignoring of Georgia should take place. Georgia stands ready both on the socio-cultural issues, geopolitical issues, economic issues, and then in terms of its overall sort of adherence to Western values, and of course its partnership with the United States.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that you have all of these accusations of Georgia not playing along with the West, when in fact it's been doing everything it could in order to do integrate it. They still wish to, of course, join the EU, but I just want to show this little picture here for everybody to understand, right? What this kind of new geo-economic project is that the United States officially kicked off. This Trump route for peace and prosperity trip. I don't know why he always needs to put his name into every single project he works on, but okay, fine. He's that's just the narcissism. But what we're talking about here is a trading route from the Caspian Sea, right, from Azerbaijan, then going into Armenia. This little slither here is an Azerbaijani enclave, right? So it's connecting Azerbaijan with Azerbaijan, but in the middle you have Armenia, and the whole project at the moment. And this is not a done deal yet. Let me see if I can actually make this a little bit bigger. No, here, maybe like this. No. Sorry, here, like this. The little slither here is is Armenian territory, and under the current project, which is not yet in the law of Armenia, which is not yet ratified, it's just so far a letter of intent is to give this little piece is about 50 kilometers or so, if
44 kilometers, if I'm not mistaken,
40,
if I'm correctly, yeah.
44 kilometers right at the border of Iran, that would be leased to the United States for 99 years, and which would basically be a U.S. Military contractor controlled then route, right at precisely at the border of Iran, that then would lead into the enclave, and from there further into Turkey, and then can go into Europe or the Mediterranean. And that's the idea of this great connection from the Caspian to the rest of Europe. And of course, this is highly problematic because it's at the border with Iran, and because it will cut off more or less north-south trade, right? It will be physically in the way of north-south trade. Not that Azerbaijan is currently very supportive of a Russian Iranian trade through its territory, and not that there's not a way through the Caspian Sea to do this, but it is going to be another geo-economic project in the region. Now, was Vance's trip thoroughly connected to just this one, trying to negotiate with Azerbaijan and Armenia, or did you actually see more going on behind the scenes in the Vance trip?
Sure. Well, we can take this a step further. So, in addition to basically this major geoeconomic project, right? The question arises geopolitically: where does this leave Armenia? Because I think Azerbaijan is in a much stronger position, right? Azerbaijan is much more allied with Turkey, Israel, etc. Armenia, and here is why I mentioned Georgia, sort of strategic patience comes in handy here, because Armenia jumped into this, just dived in. It's lost its territory, right? Let's be honest here. What happened with the Second Karabakh War? Azerbaijan won, took its sort of for the 30 plus years of um, recognized territory back, Nagorno-Karabakh. And now Armenia is being viewed as basically desperate strategically. Political risk that Armenia has, I think, is much higher than either Georgia in its current state or Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan has fully restored its sovereignty, and it's got backing from the Western world, basically. Um, but Armenia's situation, especially with basically Armenia has no security guarantees that come from the West. It has promises that the United States might rebuild or restore its Soviet nuclear program infrastructure for the civilian use, right? Russia isn't saying much about, because it's got the Russian, the Soviet era leftover, civilian nuclear plants for civilian usage. And one of the projects, one of the trips plans is to rebuild and with Western money, with American money, Armenia's energy infrastructure, and to what extent they will actually do that is also hangs in the air. Russia watches this very carefully, and I think. Short of sort of equipping Armenia in terms of sort of a military support, yes, Russia might acquiesce to a lot of things that are taking place, but But the only reason Russia is doing it, in my view, is because it knows that Armenia has nowhere else to go, other than perhaps hope that the United States will redevelop its economic infrastructure, for example. Because Armenia's long-term strategy hasn't been defined. It's doing what it's doing just to survive, basically, but it cannot really get out of Russia's control and Russia's influence, even though Trump is coming in there promising all kinds of goodies for Armenia's sort of economic long-term development. So Then the question is, will the region turn back into what we've talked about, which is sort of this geopolitical space where geoeconomics will prevail and national security interests will be balanced by large investments, say, from America, right? And as long as those red lines are not crossed, will the region sort of shape and sort of reform into this relationship sort of geopolitical space where all these major and middle powers will get along more or less based on commercial interests and transactions, which is basically what a lot of people in Georgia, right, have been saying, that open up the region, focus mostly on bringing these major powers and let their let their strategic interests sort of translate into geoeconomic interests, which will dramatically reduce the possibility of actual wars breaking out every 5 or 10 years or so. Um, and if Trump manages to do this, more health to him, right? If Trump manages to, I don't think Putin will oppose this or sabotage this. Again, this is mostly economics and geoeconomics. So there's a potential there for collaboration and cooperation regionally and internationally. But nevertheless, Armenia has to watch where it's going and what it hopes for, because again, it's naked. Strategically, it is naked. It's got no guarantees that the West, in my opinion, will ever provide.
No, no. I mean, if you look at this, you just realize that if Azerbaijan did to mainland Armenia what it did to Nagorno-Karabakh, and Nagorno-Karabakh was somewhere over here. It was a Armenian enclave inside mainland Azerbaijan. Well, it wouldn't change that much geoeconomically, right? Azerbaijan and Turkey are very strong allies. They are very strongly affiliated with each other, also through the religion and so on. You just see that in the biggest squeeze at the moment definitely is on Armenia, and Georgia in the north. Actually, in this sense, is a little bit outside of the area of intense competition. I mean, if you're squeezed between Russia, Turkey, and Iran, I mean, this is a kind of a very important place geopolitically, geoeconomically, that should be a buffer and a bridge, and hopefully not a front to a next kind of confrontation, which then maybe gives us a segue into the question of Iran. I mean, there's a lot of tension currently, again, of course, because in the south, you've got all of this naval buildup and the US threats of using its navy against Iran. But in the north, Azerbaijan, in the last war, the 12-day war, also played along with the United States, and at least for intelligence gathering, was providing its territory to do so. And there's considerable fears that Azerbaijan, in the next round of exchanges and blows, might actually be a staging ground to attack Iran from the north. How likely do you judge that to be, that the Caucasus will become some sort of theater of war against Iran?
The Caucasus will be sort of the outer limit. It will be affected. It won't be affected directly, but in terms of logistics, Georgia will be affected. Armenia will be affected. I think Armenia has to be especially careful here because Iran has supported Armenia, and it really should think twice about what where to put his strategic eggs in which basket. Iran has, sure, supported also Russia, but it has also maintained, modicum of stability in the region, vis-a-vis Azerbaijan and Armenia. It has supported Armenia again in its separatist, in the war between the two countries. So certainly, first and foremost, refugees, but then refugee flows that raises enormous risk for Georgia as well. But then also, sort of mechanisms of trade might be disrupted. And you know, I think on the trip, if Russia will become very proactive, right? Russia will become very proactive, and trip might, if Zangezur corridor becomes the only corridor that's sort of protected under the aegis of the United States, America, sort of Washington's policy towards Zangezur corridor and whole trip will escalate. And to balance against any north-south or east-west corridors that might compete with it, especially if we can isolate Iran. Well, Russia won't like that at all. So, where in this equation Armenia be stuck is another question. So I think there will be a disruption both in geoeconomic connectivity projects, physical projects. There might be a disruption, and then also geopolitically, these small states will face a choice, basically. And one of the reasons Georgia is being sort of, I would argue, sort of under the radar or quiet is because he doesn't really want to be seen as aligning with either of these regional states while keeping its relations with all of them. On an even keel, if you will. So that's the smartest policy they can pursue. But with Armenia, and if the United States by that time, if it starts to sort of look at this and says, "Look, this is our long-term investment, and you either have to, support us vis-a-vis Iran." Yeah, either through some logistical projects or accepting refugees, or then Armenia will find itself in a pickle, in my view. So, Georgia will also be pressured. Depends on the scale and the depth and breadth of this conflict and how large. We all know by now that it won't be a surgical attack, even though Washington might be feeling a little emboldened after the 12-day war. Um, General Kane, a very respected general, just recently, I'm sure you've heard, basically said was it Wall Street Journal or was it during the Security Council meeting that this, if United States decides to attack Iran, this will be a major sort of a regional flare-up that U.S. will not be able to control afterwards. Obviously, including the Hormuz Strait shutdown and energy infrastructure, and the skyrocketing of energy prices, et cetera, et cetera. Every equation basically calls against the invasion, against the bombing of Iran, and going ahead with this campaign. But again, this shows you the implications, how wide-ranging and how all regionally all-encompassing this could become. So that the overflow effect will certainly be felt in the South Caucasus. Georgia will be pressured probably, in terms of not, forbidding usage of its um, um,
Space.
airspace. Refugees will have to come in, and just overall disruption of geoeconomic connectivity projects. It will be at risk, certainly.
Yeah, looking only at the south and at the basically and at the Middle Eastern theater doesn't cut it, right? It will have direct influences to the north as well, to the Caucasus, and the dangers are quite large. What's your assessment of how you think Azerbaijan will play this, Mr. Aliyev, who has been very, very pro US, but very much also surprisingly pro-Israeli in its also in his rhetoric, for a Turkic Muslim nation is quite surprising to me. But the Azerbaijan is playing a very, in my view, a very dangerous game, actually, also in its very strong, also anti-Russian rhetoric, including about the some arrests that were made of Azerbaijani criminal gangs in Russia last year, and the outrage that caused. There was an airplane incident which Russia also apologized for, and that was very much though used for PR purposes in Azerbaijan. What's your assessment on this one, and why is it that Mr. Aliyev is playing such a dangerous game for a country that is, could be directly involved in very, very dangerous military affairs?
I personally would analyze Mr. Aliyev's recent leadership as sort of um, getting sort of attracted with his carried away with his success. He's conducted some brilliant foreign policy regionally, but then the question becomes, when do you slow down? And I know certainly that he understands the Russian factor, that there is a limit to this hubris. He There is also talk that they might look sort of the Balkanization of Iran, and there is a large minority of Azerbaijani Iranians live in Iran. Separatism, but that actually comes from the collective West and sort of the Washington's thinking that if the regime change is not going to happen, they might just dissect the country into ethnic minorities. Um, I don't
So you think he's getting ready for the spoils of war? Is that you think that's on his mind? As in, yeah, if Iran breaks up, then we're gonna get to go and take the Azeri part.
Correct, but then what will Russia do? I think if I'm Azerbaijan, I'll just stay back and watch this happen. I would not be involved in it because, again, this is something that if Russia is not forgetting anything that's happening in the region. Believe me, Russia is watching this very carefully. Russia understands the red lines. China understands Russia's red lines. Not to mention the three South Caucasus republics. Um, y- y- you know, and so I think when it comes to geopolitics and security and national security interests of the Russian Federation, I think that Aliyev understands that he can only push the envelope so far. Um, there is a economic dependency intercourse between the two countries. Azerbaijan needs Russia, and so you know, Russia can spoil Azerbaijan's sort of parade very quickly. It can disrupt the economic trade. It can come up with some scandalous report that shuts down exports or imports. And so that's something that Aliyev needs to really avoid. Um, and I think it's understood at this point. If I'm Aliyev, I'm just sitting back and I'm watching. I would not want to look like I'm getting some sort of a Mossad intelligence. I'm becoming sort of a hub for Israel against Iran in the region, or some sort of a NATO troop buildup against Iran in the region. That's not what I would want to do. Against
Yeah.
Russia, or be perceived that way, because it will kick in another security dilemma. And we saw this classic security dilemma with Russia and Ukraine, right? And so that's this case that Baku will have to avoid, in my view.
Yes, but you and I, we are good neutralists in the sense that we think countries should have good relationships with all other countries as much as possible. But we know there are people who don't think like that, right? We know that there's the NATO crowd which thinks in deterrence only, and which thinks in, like, as Jeffrey Sachs keeps saying, on the chessboard and where are my pieces, and they would love to incorporate a piece in the Caucasus into their realm, right? So. But you don't think that Mr. Aliyev is crazy enough to actually go for that and to basically open itself up to become a NATO hub?
No.
That
If he does, it would be a huge mistake on his part, and I think he's too clever for that. I think in the long-term strategic view, he understands that Russia won't tolerate that. Um, and the Kremlin has mentioned it on numerous occasions. And so then the question we have to ask ourselves: once this war is over, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and a lot of experts, as we all know, say that this is going to be a military solution rather than a diplomatic solution. Once it's over, however ugly that victory will be for Russia, what do you do? Russia will revert back and take a look back at its backyard. There is no doubt in my mind. There is also no doubt in my mind that Russia is a much more powerful state, military state than Azerbaijan. And there is not a single country in the region that will come to Azerbaijan's aid, God forbid, if Russia decides to uh, stoke some military conflict. Okay, the United States won't come because it's not NATO. It's the Caspian region, it's the South Caucasus. In other words, the same formula that has been taught to mislead these three republics, and mostly in this case Georgia, still remains to be a very effective formula. Provoke against Russia, make these countries feel like they can come on and do business with us, attract them as much as possible, then escalate the situation where Russia will say enough is enough, and then abandon them at the end of the day. In my view, geostrategically, that formula has not changed simply because the West does not have tangible, concrete instruments of power to block Russia or to what? To do nation building in the South Caucasus to the point where it will uh, build some sort of a strategic sanitaire against Russia. It cannot create some sort of a separate heaven underneath it, under the Russian strategic underbelly. So that's what we need to constantly keep in mind. Yes, it was a brilliant victory on part of Aliyev. Yes, he gained enormous sort of respect and reputation and power, but there is a limit to that strategic vision, and I think it's understood in Moscow and it's understood in Baku.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind is that Azerbaijan is quite in Mr. Aliyev's rule isn't the most democratic in the world, let's put it this way, but that the system, the Azerbaijani political system, is probably not as captured by Western NGOs as other places are. Also, Georgia is actually not managed to have laws on its books that make sure that there's some transparency, because we've seen the approach of the West, of the United States, to basically foster client regimes through infiltrating civil society. And I'm sorry, I have to put it into these words, because that's what it is. That's what all of these approaches to have NGOs that work in the media space, that work in the civil society space, that then influence government, that then influence political parties, that then get adherence to policies. That's what this is made of. The whole National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, kind of sponsored organizations. And we've seen how in the Caucasus, maybe the only place where this has been working somewhat is actually Armenia, where we now have a very kind of, in my view, a backsliding, a democratic backsliding under the current leadership, against forces that would be very friendly to the approach of Georgia, of trying to not make enemies. But both Georgia and Azerbaijan, in this sense, I would say, are under more of a still independent nationalistic kind of leadership that would be able to oppose suicidal policies. Or do you see it differently?
No, I mean, I wouldn't quite compare. Well, I want to compare sort of Georgia's, government with that of Aliyev's. Azerbaijan's internal government model is different, and it's their
Yes,
business. But
yes.
yeah, but in terms of Georgia has elections, except that our of all the people in the world, it is our Western partners that don't want to recognize those elections. So you can see what sort of a mad world we're living in. But generally speaking, Georgia's internal political and domestic political environment is quite vibrant. If there were a healthy opposition, and by the way, opposition has admitted this before too. That they just have not been able to put together a cohesive democratic coalition, other than wanting to overthrow everything they dislike. So, but even then, you mentioned NGOs. Well, we know that NGO issue has been constant in Georgia for the past, let's just
Right.
say, 5 years. And some of our colleagues have written some great analysis on that, how USAID, for example, if it hadn't been shut down, who knows how much more pressure Tbilisi would have come under. And we also know now in retrospect that yes, National Endowment of Democracy and think tanks on the neoliberal side. This is all sort of a huge uh, a system, if you will, ideological system that directly or indirectly has played a role in, at the very least, escalating the situation, polarizing the society between pro and anti-Russian and pro-Western and anti-Western, and so that's how they always have this sort of plausible uh,
Deniability.
intangibility. No, it was not us, and we just promote democracy, and we're telling you what the rule of law is and what the liberal institutionalism is. Well,
But if you don't do as we tell
but if
you,
you
then
don't, we
we're going
tell
to
you, yeah,
sanction you.
correct,
You will be
correct.
sanctioned
How
if
can we
it's
be
not
bad? Yes,
liberal
exactly.
democracy.
And Georgia has survived through all that, which is commendable, really. And yes, Georgia has a lot of problems. I always say that, but I think overall, none of these problems is worth overthrowing the government. It's not even near that issue. So, but again, it's our democratic friends that want that to happen.
Yeah.
I think when you just to go back to your point very quickly, in terms of Azerbaijan and Georgia, one commonality I would point out is that both states are pro self interest
Yeah.
and sovereignty. So I
That's
think
what that's
both
what I meant
states.
when I compare them. They are
Correct.
completely different systems, but they have the ability to think about their what is best for them, right? As
That's
opposed
exactly
to,
right.
let's say, Ukraine.
And which is something that we cannot quite say about Armenia currently, right? Because again,
Right.
Armenia, what
Right.
what does Armenia want? Is it the sovereignty or whatever is left of it, or does it want to sort of embrace something that is abstract and not embraceable, really? So I think that's where the big strategic difference is between, say, Georgia, Armenia. Georgia is sort of looking back, sitting back, having learned its lesson, um, and sort of tries to get as much sort of efficiency out of that strategy as possible without getting too excited.
Right. Right. Okay. I think that really brought us back and closed the circle because, kind of we're back at what the Western approach to its liberal democracy, as in anything that supports us is democracy, and anything that doesn't share our view of how politics should develop is authoritarian and needs to be fought against, like Imedi TV now, unfortunately. Um, Lasha, people who want to follow your work and your analysis, where should they go?
They should go and see the neutrality studies. They should also go and look up my articles on Acura and also in the national interest.
Okay. I will try to link all of these sources in the description below. Lasha Kasradze, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Pascal.